Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're now ready to start. Welcome to this afternoon's meeting of Prosperous Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and thank you to you all for getting here today. My journey was a bit of a nightmare, so I can only imagine yours was too. So we'll get on with the meeting. If anyone does want to take jackets off, it is a bit warmer in here than it is outside and in the council chambers, so if you want to remove your jacket, feel free. As well, if you are moving around the building, although this building is COVID secure, please can you wear a mask if you do need to step out to the toilet or to take a call. Okay, so we'll go straight on to item 1, which is apologies. Jonathan.
Received apologies, Chairman, from Ian Lawson, Philippa Hayden, Mr Hussain, who's going to be late but is attending, and I've also had notification that Darryl Ayres is having to self-isolate.
Thank you for that. Item number 2, are there any declarations of interest? No? Okay. Item 3, minutes of meeting held on the 16th of September. Can we say that they are a true record for all those that are here? Thank you. I'll sign those now. And that takes us straight on to item number 4, Flood Risk Management Report 2021, and I'll hand straight over to the Cabinet Member for Environment, Infrastructure and Climate Change, Councillor Simon Tagg.
Thank you. Are we having a presentation from the group, or are we just going straight into it?
Just need to share my screen, Chairman.
Yeah. Chair, while getting so the group are coming after or before Eckershaw group, are they after? Okay, right, okay. So while Jonathan is finding the presentation, I'll do the introduction first of all. Obviously, Flood Risk Management Team of the County Council, Jamie Cooper is the officer sitting next to me, and James, who I would say is his boss, is also sitting next to me here. Staffordshire County Council is the leader authority working in partnership with the Environment Agency, Severn Trent, District and Borough Councils, parishes, landowners and our communities to reduce the flood risk that may threaten properties, livelihoods and lives. There is no doubt that instances of flooding has increased, along with heavy rain and intense rain events related to climate change. The County Council is committed to refreshing its flood risk management strategy, taking into account lessons learned from recent flood events. And 3 areas for me is future-proofing, 2, mitigation measures, and 3 is alert and protect. I'm keen for the County Council and its partners should look to future-proof against the effects of climate change by future modelling, increasing capacity, and linking it to a resilient road network. We will learn from, and we do learn from Section 19 flood investigation reports, which are published annually. Those lessons learned go into the next phase of flood mitigation and protection. Secondly, we need to continue to mitigate issues by implementing flood defence schemes. This is primarily funded through central government and through the local levy grants, which is administered by the Environment Agency. Now, examples in recent years of this, where the County Council, along with its partners, have brought in money for flood mitigation schemes, is in Burton, Huntingdon and Stonell. And we've also supported a levy bid this year, along with the Environment Agency, to score funding for Sandon Road in Stafford. There are 30 schemes which are attached to the agenda, with various schemes as part of a 6-year programme. Thirdly, the County Council has been successful in a bid to the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Fund for circa £6 million over 6 years for a programme to bring about fair, approach to community flooding. Now, FAIR stands for Flood Awareness, Inform and Resilience, and its key deliverables are better communication on all sources of flood risk, trailing warnings for surface water flooding, better understanding the flood risk to communities, and having action plans in place for those communities so that we can get them prepared for flooding incidents and where they can then find information and make safe measures if necessary. And it's aimed to put the community in the key decision making with the partners, with active engagement and bringing about sustainable solutions so that communities can be involved and have ownership in those problems. So that's my introduction, but I will hand over now to Jamie, who's got the presentation. Jamie.
Thank you, Councillor Tagg. Following on from those comments of Councillor Tagg, what I thought I'd do here is something a little bit different and try and break down what the work we do day to day and the different elements of work that we do. So you'll see on this slide two headings. One is planning, one is investigations and projects. These are roughly the two main areas that we deal with in flood risk management as the flood team and as a lead local flood authority. And you'll see, for example, for planning at the start, that we have a duty to respond to major planning applications. So all surface water drainage design for new builds that come to us that are major development, we have a look at to ensure that the flood risk downstream is not increased and wherever possible it is reduced. That is primary because obviously what we don't want to do is to increase the flood risk for new builds. You know, we don't want to create new problems. So that's a duty that we have under the Floods and Water Management Act to respond to planning applications. We also have a duty to look at land drainage consents. And in regards to planning applications, in the last year we've seen about a 20% increase within highways applications in the last year. So that's one element of work that we do. The other primary element of work that we do are flood investigations and projects. Now, we have a duty under the Floods and Water Management Act again, under something called Section 19, to report which risk management authorities have relevant function and the extent to which they intend to exercise those functions. So there's a lot of partnership working with these flood investigations. Currently we expect about 15 Section 19 reports due imminently, certainly this financial year. We also have schemes at various stages from conception all the way through to completion. Currently we're in a new 6-year programme. 6-year programme started this financial year. We have about 30 schemes in that. We also get funding for different projects, and one of those is the Fair Risk project. One thing to stress, which is the banner in blue at the bottom, is that we are one risk management authority of many, and the Environment Agency, Severn Trent Water, Highways, Canals and River Trust and the Sound Penk IDB in Stafford are also have functions in flood risk. It's important that we recognise that. So moving on, what I thought we'd do is show our mapping system, because those are the two primary works that we do, planning and flood investigations, and what's really important is that we have good data and information. So here you'll see our flood zones. These are reported from the Environment Agency. These are river flooding. Second slide, surface water maps. And what we've done with these, you'll see they're all at different categories. So these are all 30-year. So the darker the blue, the more risk that the property is within. It's important to note that we can't share our actual database, which I'd like to do and go through some of the things, because some of it's sensitive information. So this is a fictional area, so we see some of the street names. That's why they're probably not akin to Staffordshire. So then what we've done is we've mapped all those different areas that are at risk, and we've put in each property that's at risk. So for the whole of Staffordshire, you'll now see on our mapping system all the properties that we think are at risk based on maps. Okay? This is all the different return periods that you'll see. So red again is the ones that are more at risk. Then what we typically do is we get, obviously we know that there's been a flood event because of the rainfall. And so then what we'll do is we'll start to figure out which areas have flooded, and we'll issue questionnaires. We have a questionnaire published on our website and we get that feedback. And what you'll notice is that this map, compared to the previous one, is a lot less intense. And that's because a lot of the time we don't get great feedback from questionnaires. But the questionnaire data is important because it allows us to distinguish between what's internal and what's external flooding. Okay, so typically the only accurate data that we have are these questionnaire returns. Although in reality, the next slide, you'll see that in reality, once we do a Section 19 report and we go and door knock and we talk to people and we look at the evidence of flooding, you see more, obviously we get more cases of flooding, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the accurate picture, it's just the best picture that we can get. The other data that we hold on our system are sewer data, so this is water companies that hold these. In our areas, it's Severn Trent Water and United Utilities. Then we have this map, so we can see where the sewers are, we can see where the manholes are, we can see where the outfalls are. We also have highways data, so we have about 190,000 gullies mapped for highways within the county. They're all mapped. We also have a few surveys that we have of watercourses, culverts, pipes. We also have bridge information. We also have hundreds of drainage scans that we've scanned in from old developments that show us as-built drawings of previous designs so that we can understand the network of different pipe systems and watercourses that are within our area. So that gives us a good understanding, just as a desk-based thing, of the different data that we have and historical information. We then also add our planning layer. So it's important to note that we can do this from both perspectives. We can look at it from the planning position, to look at what past flooding we've had and what data we have, and we can look at it if there's a new flood to see whether there's been a flood before, and again what data we have. So moving on, all that is great, and a lot of the time we will get funding from typically national or regional funding to get schemes ideally. Now the problem with that is that a lot of the time we haven't got the cost benefits for smaller developments, and we rely on smaller interventions. And often the funding isn't there for that. And the second thing is we really want to engage with communities better. So on the basis of lessons learned over the last couple of years, we put in a bid last financial year for this, which is a fair approach to community flood risk. We're the only successful lead local flood authority within the Trent Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. It was a scheme that was set up for the Environment Agency to compete for funds, and we worked with various different parties. You can see them all on here. Critically, the areas will be the Black Country and Stoke and Staffordshire, so it will be in that area working with various partners. What does fair mean? Well, what it means is, for residents, what we really want them to be is resilient. What we really want them to do is to own their flood risk, understand their flood risk, and work between the gaps of what the public sector can do, what the private sector can do, and what the communities can do. But in order to be resilient, you first have to be informed of your risk. So you have to know what different types of flooding that you get. You have to know what warnings you're going to get. And before you're informed, you have to be aware. You have to know that you're actually going to flood. And some communities aren't. So that's the approach that we're taking. And the detail of that is here. So we're tackling this in a twofold manner. So one is to have a look at a generic approach across the whole county for all those that are flood risk or interested in flood risk. Please tell me if I'm going over time. The one approach will be a website with live information as a generic thing. So we want one website. There are a few out there. For example, there is the Eye of Calderdale, if you want to have a look at that as an example. But we want to push the boundaries to get the best in class and have a website that's got live and static information of all the information that you'd want to know about flooding for communities. The second thing is that we want to improve communications. We know that there's, that these can be improved and communities can engage with us better. So we are looking at avenues about how we do that. The third thing is that we'll be forecasting and warnings for river and surface water. So we want to have, we're going to trial, and this is novel, in the country at least, is to try and give surface water warnings out to communities. At present, only the Environment Agency give river warnings for larger rivers. We want to push that so that communities can be aware and be informed about what risk they face, so that they can have a forecasting system. Lastly, and this really is cutting edge, we want to trial artificial intelligence. So if you imagine, say, a trash screen, so a screen that's on a watercourse, we want to put a camera there, and for that camera to learn whether that trash screen gets blocked. And that self-learning then will give an alert out to whoever needs it to tell them that trash screen is blocked, which is useful prior to a storm. Okay. In the green then, we then take a targeted approach. So to do that, we're going to do a full community risk assessment. And this isn't just about what houses flood, it's about what impacts the community. So if there's a critical building within that community, a school, some sort of leisure centre or something that combines that community together, we'll look at the whole effect on the community rather than just the properties. From that, we'll then have a list of all the different communities and different types of community that we think are at risk. Then the approach is to have, and we've secured this, so it's important to note that we haven't got this funding yet. We've still got to go through business case, but we have been successful in securing this. When the funding comes, we'll have a pot of money for those different communities that we identify as valid for it, for capital intervention. And that capital intervention is meant for small-scale measures, with the idea being that we give to the communities then something that will help them in the way of for example, a community road closure. We give them the infrastructure that we work with landowners, and we give them that capital. Then the idea is that the community can also help by doing their own things informed by warnings that allows the community to own that risk. And finally, that will all be built up in plans. So hopefully that addresses some of the gaps that we've seen over the last year, and we really want this to be a national project really that really pushes it out there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon and Jamie. Do any members have questions? Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. I really want to start off by saying how much, from my division's point of view, I appreciate the work that we're doing as far as flooding is concerned. Representing a large rural area, we suffer very, very considerably from flooding. And I was just noting here the sort of things which hit us and how that fits in with the strategy that we're looking at. Clearly, and David may want to say something, as far as highways are concerned, I think looking at highways and agriculture together, the work that we're doing as far as the landowner's responsibility is concerned, as far as ditches are concerned, we seem to have historically ignored the responsibility and the role of ditches. And I think that if we can do something aggressively as far as improving the network of ditches that we have, I think it would make a big difference to road flooding. And I think that we need to look at agriculture and the water which is coming off the land, which is now far greater than we would have seen in the past because of the flood risks that we have of water coming off the land. I'm also interested when we refer to planning. I think that if we're looking at how we're going to manage water, we largely need to look at how we can delay water getting into the main system so that we don't give a shock to our rivers, but we slow down the way that water gets into the rivers. And I feel disappointed in some ways when it comes to our district and borough councils that they're not insisting that flood mitigation schemes, like the one that we've just installed at the county in the new Burntwood Health Centre, where we actually take all the water and reuse it where we can and release it into the system in a way that the system can cope with it. And I do understand the problems that we have as far as flooding is concerned, that we're looking at a system which is very, very largely Victorian. And I did some work with the cathedral at one stage, And the cathedral has a horrendous problem because it has massive areas of roofs with gutters that can't carry the volume of water. And when the water does come down, it all goes into the network and floods. And also, I just wanted to mention my sort of concern with the Environment Agency. I have a particular problem where I think I have in my division one of the few areas where I have a road that you cross through a stream to get through. The Environment Agency, where this is particularly affected by what's happening with HS2, the crossing over the stream is getting to the point where it's not possible to get over. And that is not in our area of responsibility, but it's the area of Environment Agency. And they seem to be very, very slow on their feet in the way that they support us in the things which we're trying to do. Thank you, Chairman.
Jamie, did you want to respond to that now, or do you want all questions and then respond? No, I think I'll have a go. Microphone, please.
Thank you. I'll have a go, and then obviously if there's any more questions after that, then I can address those. So, the first point was about ditches. Now, we have a duty under the Land Drainage Act. So we have powers under the Land Drainage Act that allow us to enforce on owners. The key thing is that the ditches themselves are riparian owned, so they're owned by landowners. So we don't own the ditches, we just have powers over them. Now, it's a very fine art to distinguish what is a ditch that doesn't allow the proper flow of water and a ditch that does. But clearly where it goes into those lines, we can enforce. The key thing that we do, there has to be some significant flood risk for us to do that. So if it's in agricultural land, for example, then we would be more reluctant to enforce on that. If it were in, with property flooding and there was a clear blockage of a watercourse, then we would consider enforcement. Obviously, we work with landowners first of all to try and rectify the problem unless it's critical. That's the last resort, but we can do that and we do have powers to do that. In terms of agriculture, we don't really have any powers afforded to us to allow us to enforce on practices that different landowners might be doing. There are different, for example, you can talk to the Rural Payments Agency if landowners have funds, and that Rural Payments Agency will have something called a soil protection review, which is supposed to integrate how you manage water. So there is that angle, but there aren't any powers afforded to us. What we do have coming is the Environment Agency are looking into a project that's due next financial year into how to work with landowners and farmers better to understand how we can fund or work with landowners. A lot of the time it's just talking to landowners to see what's possible. Beyond that, we're hoping that the FAIR projects in critical areas will include landowners as part of the community, and we can work with them to see what measures we can undertake to reduce flood risk. So as a planning, we have a duty to look at major planning, major development for planning. So it's important that we note that it's only for major development. So minor development doesn't come under this. For major development, we ensure that the first thing that the developer has to do is to figure out where the water's going to go, typically soak away watercourse or sewer. If it's going to a watercourse or sewer, then it needs to make sure that the water that passes on is no more than the current situation, ideally less. So that ensures that the amount of flow that's passed on is not increased for downstream receptors. Of course, then we have to store the water, and that makes sure that the development's safe. The design standards for that are 100-year plus climate change. It's quite a large thing that we're doing. If you think that the roads will be inevitably flood in those types of events, the develop itself will be safe. In terms of the Environment Agency, they have oversight of main rivers. Again, they're only responsible for the assets that they construct next to them. They're not responsible for the landowner is ultimately responsible for those watercourses. The Environment Agency, obviously it depends on the specifics then of what the Environment Agency can or can't do. They do have powers under the Water Act if there's a blockage in a watercourse. Typically, if the silt levels in the main river, the argument is that once you get a large flood, it doesn't make too much difference because you're spreading over a large floodplain once you get to the larger rivers. So the effect of siltation of watercourses is not as pronounced as it would be, say, if you've got a small watercourse next to houses that are more proximal. Okay, thanks.
Councillor Hutton.
Thank you, Chair. Quick question. I was asked recently something on flooding. What happens if a culvert goes through private land and that culvert collapses and causes a flood on adjacent land and roads? What are the council's powers in such a situation? Thank you.
Yeah, under the Land Drainage Act, we have emergency powers. So likely in that situation, we've made aware of it, and we couldn't get hold of the landowner immediately, or the landowner couldn't do it, then we do have powers to go in and rectify that problem, and we'd probably use our delivery partner, Amy, to see what we can do in terms of, you know, trying to rectify that.
Councillor Flunder.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just firstly say thanks to Jamie for working with us on many occasions, and lots of this is coming up. I'm not going to say which schemes or anything else, but I'm very glad to see the last slide. That's all I can say at the moment in terms of, I think that sort of summarises exactly where the strategy is going and everything else. I have a question on that for Simon at the end. During the other presentation that you've done, or the written presentation that you gave us as well, the idea of sharing data, I got a little bit confused about that. The fact that, you know, we can't sort of find out ourselves necessarily what the information that you might have in terms of flood risk and all the rest of it. So I just needed you to expand on that slightly, because I think that would help a lot of local people maybe understand things a little bit better before they come and ask us and maybe make waves towards what's going on at the moment. Sorry about the pun there. In terms of numbers, sorry, I thought you might enjoy that one. In terms of numbers of properties being affected across the whole county, in the actual script it says that it's an estimate and tends to go up and down quite a lot with the numbers that are in there. Could you just explain why that is the case and why that might be improved in the future? That would certainly help as well. And I'm great to see the idea, which is what we've done with highways, and David knows quite a lot of projects that we've been doing with highways as well, but the idea of getting evidence, the idea of producing new evidence, and the idea of improved communications, which was on the last slide, really in terms of how that might work as well, particularly for us with parishes. It might be through parishes. What in general, how do we disseminate that information through members? Is it something that we could help with? And then finally, a question to Simon, if at all possible, and that's the implementation timetable of that last slide, those ideas you have there. Is that something that we need to monitor, you think, as a committee, and what sort of timescales are involved? So I think that's enough to be getting on with. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Flunder. I'm not sure if I can get the presentation back up, but it's probably useful just to go through some of those slides again to explain the property problem. Right, so, excuse me. That's it. Is that showing? Yeah. Yeah. In terms of the properties then, these are the mapped properties that we have. So once we get a flood, let's just say, you can see some of those properties there are 1 in 30 year. If we get, say, a 1 in 5 year flood, a small flood, and we get notified that there's a few properties that are flooded, well, that tells us that there's probably a problem there, because we wouldn't, especially if it's as large as that whole area, the red, the yellow and the green, because we wouldn't expect that many properties to be flooded. Okay, so that gives us an idea of some semblance of how we prioritise things. Another area may be a 100-year flood event and we haven't got any properties, so again, probably tells us that there isn't so much of a priority. The thing that happens then is that we will have a look to see how many properties are probably at risk. within our strategy, we look for 5 or more properties that are flooded to see how many properties are flooded, and that's what our strategy says, that you have to investigate under Section 19 if we have 4 or more residential properties that internally flood. So we'll have a look to see how many properties are at risk. Then what we'll do is we will have a site visit and have a look at those properties in person. And perhaps, obviously, COVID's not allowed us to do that as well over the last couple of years, but we will door knock and talk to community members, hand out questionnaires to them for them to fill in, to get better understanding of what that information is. And from that, we will then get feedback in terms of questionnaires, hopefully. We've got these in paper form and we have them digitally, so whichever method we prefer, we can do that. But like I said, the turnout rate for those isn't great. So what then happens is we talk to communities a bit more, and we have what is probably our best guess of the amount of properties that flood. So we have different categories of flooding. We have those that are verified through questionnaires, we have those that are risk through mapping, and we have those that once we've done an investigation we believe is the actual area that's flooded. And it's really difficult to figure out which one is the accurate one because the only accurate one is the questionnaires, but we know that's an underestimate. So that's it in terms of datas and properties. And then in terms of evidence and giving comms, we will improve this with the FAIR project, is to have a better website that shows all the information that communities can have and links to questionnaires so that people can fill them in a lot more easily. And we want the Google searches, etc., to be quite targeted to those. We are doing an interim thing as well, conscious that that's not coming till probably next financial year. So we are doing an interim step to have a look at how we can work with highways, for example, on data.
Yeah, just to back what Jamie has said there, I think it's important we do get this up and running as soon as possible. I think with it being a community focused and directed towards the community, I think us as members across the county have a role to play in this, and the Scrutiny Committee also has a role to monitor how this is rolled out. As I say, it could be a step change in the right direction, and that money needs to be well spent to set up the infrastructure around this for early warnings, for help, for self-help, as Jamie has said, as well, as we move forward on this project. So yeah, I think the Scrutiny Committee can have a central role in that.
Simon, mine was about the timescale of implementation.
As Jamie's just said, obviously with the next financial year coming along, work will be up and running on this, and I think it's important that we do, and I'll be making sure we have this in place as soon as possible.
Councillor Ross.
Thank you, Chair. I was interested to note that I'm very impressed that you were looking at early warning systems on stormwater systems. As you mentioned, the Environment Agency has already got quite a comprehensive system in place. Just a couple of observations on that, or concerns, I suppose, is that, and how you're going to deal with it. My first thought was the actual speed of the flooding. With river flooding, you tend to have, particularly if you have a lot of upstream data and catchment data that gives you a more long-term, although it can still be quite rapid, quite a long-term heads up, if you like, warning in advance, where stormwater drainage tends to be quite flashy in nature and can happen very, very quickly. So I'm just interested that if you're confident that you can get that data to the homeowner in adequate time for them to do something about it. Secondly, is it modelled based on live data? Because again, that would make it difficult for you in terms of getting the information there. If it's modelling, that would be great. However, stormwater flooding tends to be very, very localised, and a model of a weather system can easily miss an area. And you can end up with a great danger of the boy who cried wolf, where you're constantly sending warnings to homeowners when it doesn't happen. And it can also have a negative effect, opposite of what you're trying to do, and make a community complacent rather than proactive. The only other questions, my other thought is that I think people tend to, although they don't like it, there's an acceptance that rivers flood. It's a natural process, and people don't like being flooded by rivers, but it happens. Sewer flooding is different, because one, the nature of the flooding is considerably worse in terms of its impact because of the nature of the water that's flooding. And I suspect if you're saying that we know the sewer's going to flood, the question they may be asking back is, if you know it's going to flood, why are we not changing the capacity or altering the actual sewer system? You know, it's an acknowledgement there's a problem, but it doesn't seem to be a solution other than giving us some kind of a localised protection. And how you're going to overcome that potential kickback from that. And just one final observation, that, and I know it's not going to change, but it's something that's bugged me for a minute. I've worked in flood mitigation for some time, and we always talk about return periods of 1 in 30 year, 1 in 100 year, 1 in 1,000 year. And I understand why, and I know it's a historical thing within the science of it, but I think it gives people the wrong impression. And if you talk to someone who's had a 1 in 1,000 year flood event, there's a perception, that's it, it's never going to happen again. You know, this is on the timescales of Noah. Whereas if you give it as a percentage, as 1% or a 0.1%, it's a better way of defining the risk and people understanding it. And I just think, I know it's not going to change, but it's just a frustration of mine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Noted about the return periods. It's a very good point. Yeah, it does help clarify that, because we have seen multiple flood events in the last few years. So we have seen areas that have had 75-year flood events in 3 years. You know, so it does push that point home. In terms of the speed of flooding and the problem with modelling, yeah, accepted. What we're trying to do here, well, what we'll have to do is that we'll have to trial these to start with. So we'll get communities on board that are actively engaged and trial them first to test those scenarios out, to see how it works before obviously we disseminate to that. So the programme is such that these warnings will come in the latter end of that 6-year programme to make sure it's working, because the last thing we want to do is cry wolf or obviously underestimate a flood. It is a problem, and it is more tricky because you are dealing with more uncertainty the finer the scale that you get down to. So when you get bigger rivers, you accumulate those areas, it's not as big. Now, with the way that forecasting works at the moment, there are different, so we're going to get technical here, but there's different forecasts that can be used. And we can use about 50 plus forecasts together and see what the certainty those different ones have. And that certainty then is important, because it tells us how much confidence we've got in that rainfall And as you say, that gets more and more confident the closer that we get to the storm. And in thunderstorms, it may only be a couple of hours. But what it does do is at least that's a couple of hours that you didn't have before. So that at least if we do empower communities to do something, we can give them some infrastructure to say, okay, well, now it's a day before the storm. This is looking reasonably likely. You might want to start going through your community plans. You might want to start doing X, Y, and Z action, so at least they've got that knowledge. The key thing with this project is that it's got to emphasise that whole thing about being informed to understand it, so that they clearly understand what that means when that message comes through. You know, so that's why it's going to be targeted. In terms of sewers, obviously it's water companies, and the largest one in our area is Severn Trent, and they're regulated by Ofwat. So it really is a question for water companies to see whether those sewers are at the standard, the certain standards that they have to meet. As long as those standards are being met, then obviously that's the point. And if we do an investigation, we will work with Severn Trent Water to find out what they intend to do. So obviously if there is sewer flooding, what storm flooded it? Does it meet the capacity? And what do you intend to do, water company? So that's what we do as part of that investigation. Beyond that, we have worked with Severn Trent Water in various places. We've got one at the moment in Cheslin Hay doing joint schemes together. So we will recognise that it isn't just a sewer problem or surface water, it's a joint problem. And we work closely with them to try and address that using the funding that we've got.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of observations off the back of that. First of all, I think what's really key in this is partnership working. Many, many years ago, when I was more heavily engaged with this, the first question either the Environment Agency or the water company asked was, whose water was it? When inevitably, actually, it was a combination. And quite often, Severn Trent would put a stormwater model in place that removed their water, but the property still flooded because there was some form of effluvial flooding. So it's really key that you get the partners to work together. And actually, you can achieve more because there's more money in the pot there, you know, and you can all bear the burden. And just on a slight aside, I think the community thing is absolutely key to the success of these. I work with a couple of projects. One particularly stands out down in Portsmouth, where the community were engaged to find their own solution, actually. They were given support from the local water authority. They found their own solution. They went out and found the organisations they wanted to implement it. And then they, every year, had a trial run where they pretended a flood was coming to practice to make sure they were all up to speed on it, which was great. And then in the afternoon, they then have a community barbecue. But what's come out of that now is a community group, which is doing lots of other things. And I know that when COVID struck, this particular flood group was the first group that set out in terms of helping the community in terms of shopping and prescriptions and things like that. And I think it's really important for us as a county council to recognise that these flood groups are critical, but they can be the seed, like we often see with the libraries, to much of wider community engagement. But I think it's a really good thing to do. And the ownership and that buy-in is really important within the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of things, Jamie. Just going right back to the start, how do we identify the critical network in the beginning to ensure its resilience, and how do we monitor it going forwards? That's the first one. And then I'm not sure whether this comes under yourself or more Councillor David Williams' portfolio, but how far have we gone with the gully emptying cycle? Because we've clearly got issues around sewers, around capacity, and then how the impact on flooding. We all know we're working with a Victorian system that's probably not fit for today's purpose, with the amount of homes that have been built, and I can only comment on the amount of homes that have been built in Tamworth and around the area there. Old pipe work, new builds and all that, so I'll just leave you with those two for now.
Okay, in terms of the critical networks and how we monitor them, it comes back to a lot of these slides again, which is it's what the source of the flooding is. So let's just, it's hard to conceptualise everything, but if we say, imagine that there's a development that's on the side of a sloping farmland. The water runs off the farmland and then it goes into the gullies on the highway. The gullies then connect into the sewers. Those sewers then ultimately discharge into a watercourse downstream. So you've got that whole network of different responsibilities. The landowner might have a ditch they have to maintain. Highways will look at the gullies that they have to maintain. The sewer is looked after by the water company. And then downstream it might be a main river that's looked after by the Environment Agency. You've got that whole network of different things. And the one thing that we'll do then is establish what are the critical points along that path that result in that flooding. And it could be a capacity problem, or it could be a maintenance problem, or it could be a number of things. And what we do is that we will then identify which authorities have functions and then ask them to keep. So if it's a landowner, we'll write to them to remind them that it's their duty to look after a watercourse. If it's a water company, is it a capacity problem? Is it a maintenance problem? What do you tend to do? So it really comes back to this oversight of who does what and what our part in that is and how we bring about schemes. And that's something that's ongoing. You know, it isn't just something that's static. So a plan isn't just stops, scheme finished. A scheme will need maintaining, for example, and who's going to do that?
Councillor Williams, do you want to answer the second one?
Just on the gullies.
I'm going to make use of you while you're in the room.
While I'm here, might as well. Yeah, the gullies around the area, you're quite right. There's a lot of them are archaic, and some of those, especially like in Burton Town at the moment, are being changed to a different type. But as you're aware, that all the gullies in the county are on a cyclical cleanse. We've now carried out a review this year to look at which ones, with the data that we've got for how full they are being and are not being, and are altering or going to be altering the way that we attack these gullies. We've also, with an underspend in another area, have been able to put £150,000 into an extra gully team, which are working 2 weeks in every area, which are making a very big difference with difficult known gullies that we know that cause and exacerbate flooding. And we're trying to get those going forward with the Infrastructure Plus project and the Highways Transformation project. we will be having much more of a localised management of gullies and the way that they're looked after. And we will be targeting the ones that we need to. So a lot of the gully issues that we will pick up will need to go through, sometimes through the flooding team and sometimes through the water companies, to get them to get their parts sorted, such as culverts or infrastructure that's broken or not working. We're trying to get hold of them to be able to do that with proper consultation. But being an external private company, we have no power over them, so it is a case of we're going in and requesting them to work with us.
I think further to that, Chair, we've all had issues in our divisions of those flooding issues that residents have raised with us, and it's always been, you know, it's Severn Trent's job to do something about that, or it's the Environment Agency on other concerns, and there's been that sort of seems to be lack of partnership working. I mean, since I've taken over this role in May and speaking to Jamie and James, really, I mean, the relationships with both the EA and Severn Trent could be better. They are okay, but I think they need to be better, particularly with the Environment Agency when it comes to the rivers, but also with Severn Trent and the other water authorities that cover the county on those issues that are affecting residents not only in rural areas but urban areas, and that's the key relationship. But I think also County Council, you know, highway staff need to be more plugged in at the local level as well with Severn Trent, for example, in my area and in other areas, which doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. So I think we need to work on that because it's getting those, as Jamie has pointed out, when you look at the network there on those maps, you know, there are so many different people involved and our residents at the end of the day need a good service from the person that can solve it, whether that's the county, whether that's Severn Trent or any other water provider or the Environment Agency.
Councillor Hudson.
Yeah, I represent sort of two areas of Uttoxeter. As the Borough Councillor, I represent a rural area, and obviously County Councillor, I represent an urban area. And Marchington, you'll probably be aware of, has quite a substantial amount of flooding there. We have our flood wardens that have been trained, and I could just ask, can you revisit that, because I think some of them still need signing off. We have our equipment and we do get our early warning out, and we do work with the Environment Agency and also the Forestry Commission, because it's quite good common sense that if you look at the area, that the water comes down from the hills through Marchington down to the River Dove. So what we need to do is to stop that water flowing. So part of it could be that we actually fell trees and stuff, get farmers to dig ditches in their fields to stop the water coming down through the village. And if the only building that doesn't get flooded in the village is the church, because it was built on high ground. So it's very important that when we get future planning applications that we really do look at where they are going to be sited. Now, Uttoxeter itself, we've got a development called Hazel Walls, which is causing quite some concern with residents. I wasn't the member for the area when that planning application went in, but we have been assured by the county and by the Environment Agency that the developments and the developers are putting in such things to stop flooding, but the residents are still quite concerned about the amount of water that's going to come down that area. So it's something that we need to watch. So there's a substantial development going there, 439 houses, and over the last few weeks, with the amount of rain that we've had, there has been quite a few worries about the amount of water. There are some actuation areas there, some lakes that they are filling up, but the residents are worried that these lakes are actually filling up very quickly, and I think that we perhaps need to revisit that. As I say, it's a development that went through planning before I became member, but I am aware of the issue, so thank you.
Any further? Councillor Smith.
Sorry, Chairman, there were a couple of other things I wanted to raise earlier on, and I thought I'd said enough.
Just on the strategy.
Could I just ask,
Councillor Smith,
Chairman,
can you make sure that they're on the strategy and not local in my division questions? They're on the strategy, are they?
I think they relate to the strategy,
okay.
Yes. I was interested whether there was progress across the county in the use of grey water. That seems to be something that we don't seem to be moving on from a local planning area. And the other thing I was interested in is what sort of dependence we have on soakaways, because I have one in my area which is now taking so much water, it's waterlogging the field.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of grey water, it's something that we're looking at. We do have a SUDS handbook that people can refer to. It's called the Staffordshire SUDS handbook, so developers can have a look at that in terms of new development and things that they can do. It's a good thing to promote, and it's something that we'll take on board to have a look in the next strategy, I think, in terms of grey water, rainwater harvesting, and a load of other things that we can do in terms of measures. In terms of soakaways, the thing with soakaways is that you have to be really careful in their design. So you have to make sure that the groundwater doesn't vary too much. And there's quite a few technical things that you need to do with soakaways. The critical thing, of course, is that they need maintaining. Ideally, you put them in a system where they don't silt up as much, but they can be silted. And in which case, then, it really boils down to who the maintenance companies are, or who the maintenance for those on developments, who's responsible for the maintenance. Quite a technical thing, soakaways, but it is also the preferred method of discharging water because it replenishes groundwater levels. So in some circumstances, it's the preferred method of discharging surface water soakaway because you go into the ground rather than to another network, then flood someone downstream. Okay. Thanks.
Councillor Bernard Williams.
Yes, thank you. I'm just want to bring up the idea about cyclical cleaning because, you know, when you think that some areas get a 3-year clean and yet flooding occurs at that area, really should we be saying to ourselves, well, where there is actual flooding, those gullies need cleaning regularly, say every year, because every year it's actually happening that, you know, they're flooding. And consequently, like I do realise that just lately, you know, I have people who's getting in touch with me saying, you know, I'm flooding again, and yet, you know, I'm having to wait 3 years to have my gully cleansed. So would cyclical cleaning be one of the problems that we're having?
Which one of you would like to answer that? I think David's passed it to Jamie, or we batted it back.
Yes, and that's why we're doing the gully review, to change it and look at where it needs to be changed and change it accordingly. So if it needs to be more often or less often, that's what we're doing. And the cyclical cleaning wasn't perfect at the start because we weren't starting from a clean slate, but we are going from a data-led one, which will say which ones are being flooded and which aren't, and therefore we'll change it as per the data that comes through.
Councillor Tagg, did you want to come back in and then we'll finish on this item?
Yes, just the issue of planning, hasn't it, has come up a number of times by a number of members. I think working closely with districts as the planning authorities needs to happen. I think I've got some in my division, talking to James about it earlier, where we've had SUD schemes that haven't been implemented properly, haven't been followed up, haven't been enforced upon. So I think as part of our strategy, we've already had a chat about this, it needs to be, you know, working closely with the districts to ensure not only that the schemes that are put through planning are actually put in place, but also the maintenance for those going forward, as Jamie quite says, not having a brilliant SUD scheme, if it's not maintained over the years, it then becomes a problem, which leads to flooding. So I think that's a really important part of the strategy going forward.
Thank you. I'm now going to invite Mrs Sue Bramall to come and do her presentation from the Eckershaw Flooding Action Group.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me? Are you going to? Yeah. Thank you. There you go.
It's going to work. Just thinking about it.
Okay, just forward and backwards. Okay, thank you very much for inviting the Eckershaw Flood Action Group. I think it's Councillor Ward was talking about community groups, and this flood group's been around for quite a while, and we do have a very strong community in Eckershaw. So thank you for inviting us to present and for putting floods back on the agenda. I'm going to talk you through a few pieces of evidence which are drawn from the experiences of people who live in and around Eckershaw, but from what we understand, these problems are not unique to Eckershaw. And we've separately sent a few suggestions, which we sent as a separate document, given the time constraint. So if I can just paint a picture, when there is a flood, some people in Staffordshire are made homeless. This family here, I stress this is not my property, but these people were made homeless. Your home becomes uninhabitable until the dirty water is cleaned away. The dehumidifiers have stopped churning throughout the night, 24/7. The insurers are satisfied with the quotes. The workmen can fit you into their schedule, and the remediation works can be completed, and that may be for several months. So people who are flooded are very familiar with what they need to do. And I really need to mention that there are a few other circumstances where action or inaction can leave people homeless in this way. So just as I give this presentation, I'd like you to imagine that you get home this evening in the dark to find a foot of water in your property, no electricity and no Wi-Fi. And hopefully you also live in an area with good mobile reception, because Eckershaw isn't one. Who is going to come to your aid? The first problem that you'll face is that you will be expected to diagnose the cause of the flooding in order to work out who it is you should be contacting, which may not be very easy in the dark, and you may not have access to Wi-Fi, so you may not be able to get onto this new website that you're mentioning. The second problem is that the advice that is online is inconsistent across the various agencies, which starts with the government, the Environment Agency, social media. And I'm sorry, but I don't believe creating another website is going to help with that confusion. If you do reach the County Council website, and you type in report flooding, you currently get 22 results. I'd really urge you to test drive this when you get home, and it wouldn't take a computer developer very long to really improve all of this. Sorry, do I have to post this? Oh yeah, that's something. So navigate 4 more pages, and if you're lucky, you're going to arrive on the report it page. Now, bollards, which as far as I'm aware have never made anybody homeless, get 2 buttons, whereas flooding is still hidden another layer beneath under weather related. Nice and vague. Do you get the idea? There's a very good early warning system already in existence in the county, and it's called your taxpayers, who phone the council, they phone Severn Trent, and they phone all of the agencies as soon as they see the signs of a flood. And in the past 15 months, we've had 4 floods. So those people who've been flooded numerous times know exactly when the water is rising, when the drains are blocked, and when their homes are likely to be flooded. These stories were also very well documented in the parliamentary debate which was hosted by Theo Clark last year, when several Staffordshire MPs told similar stories across the county. Perhaps we could look at what happens the day after the flood. I think we all just expect that the first step is surely a proper professional investigation. However people have reported the flood, there's plenty of evidence online as well. And it should be a priority, I think, for somebody in the flood team to collate this information We are aware of the questionnaires. We've certainly filled them in. Jeremy Pert shared them to us, but we've also reported it in all the other manners possible. But the problems that we experienced in January this year in regard to the A519, first, despite several people logging the flooding on the A519 on the very days of the flood, Amy thought it was acceptable to drive by 8 days later, 8 days, remarked that the road was dry with no sign of flooding, and marked the issue was closed on the report it system. So I'm glad to hear things are changing in that regard, but I hope you will agree that that's not acceptable. Amy also told our councillor, who's had to go now, and by the Highways Liaison Officer, that the drains under the A519 had been cleaned. They told us this after floods in 2007, 2012, 2019, twice in 2020, and again in January 2021. So this is one of the most frequently flooded spots in the county. But as the data is not available, we're unable to even ascertain whether this is on the current flood register. It's quite slow. To those of us familiar with the A519, it was evident that the drains were not functioning, but the only way that we could get any engagement was to launch a formal complaint via the Executive Office of the County Council. Frankly, this is unnecessary waste of executive resources, but it did clearly show that the claims by Amy and the Highways Liaison Officer were untrue. The drains were not functioning. They had not been maintained, badly broken, one drain blocked with cement, albeit that was someone else's fault, but another two was blocked by roots which do not grow overnight. Drain covers in the verges were revealed, which villagers unanimously agreed had not been seen in more than 25 years. The drainage team themselves, who came and cleaned the drains, reported this was the first time on their system that they had been properly cleaned in over 3 decades. So is this really permissible under the multi-million-pound contract that I believe it is in place? I'm glad to hear that there are some improvements in hand. So why wasn't there any investigation given that the flooding in this location was so frequent? We all appreciate that resources are scarce and hard decisions have to be made, and we did indeed consult the flood strategy, which mentions that frequency of flooding, which is highlighted, is a factor which should be considered. It's quite slow. But on each of the 4 occasions in the last 15 months, the flood team refused to engage with anyone who was flooded, hiding behind this policy that states they will only investigate events with 5 or more residential properties. And we would urge this committee to consider whether that threshold is appropriate. Unable to get any information, and even now I understand this information is confidential, we wouldn't be able to verify whether our village or the situation in our village is in publicly available information. We were forced to resort to freedom of information requests, which again adds another layer of unnecessary cost to the county council. So back in May, we still couldn't establish whether there was an accurate list of properties flooded or whether our properties were on that list. But somehow we feel that a journalist from the Express and Star or a data scientist at Keele University could compile this information in pretty short order. We know that the insurers companies certainly have it on a property by property basis. If we can just drill down into these headline figures at the top on the right, while there were 270 odd properties in February 2020, there is actually a very, very small subset of just 4 properties which have been flooded up to 4 times. And even if those 4 homes were in a terrace next to each other, they would not trigger an investigation under the current threshold of 5. Similarly, across the county, no more than 11 homes, or maybe a few more as you claim that the numbers are not accurate, But it's not a big number of homes that are subject to the most frequent and therefore most serious flooding. And from the information provided in the strategy presented, we still do not know if any of these properties which are flooded repeatedly are within any of the areas where reports and investigations are being undertaken. So we urge you to consider taking a more sophisticated approach which takes into account the multi-dimensional impact of a flood event and does not discriminate against taxpayers in rural areas where properties by definition are further apart from each other. Another factor that should be considered is the nature of the property and the residents within. Anyone who lives in a bungalow will be made homeless. They simply cannot move upstairs for the next 6 months while their homes are renovated. Where is the consideration of residents who are elderly or vulnerable under the equality duty? The effect on mental health must not be ignored, and some of you may be aware of the very sad case of the couple from Cranbury, where flooding of their home was cited in the inquest. We note that the flood team requests another full-time officer if this threshold is to be changed, but would ask why time is being spent supporting the Black Country if there is not capacity to investigate the 4 or 11 worst flooding spots in this county. We've had people from the council say to us, "Oh, but you have insurance for that." Well, it isn't rocket science to calculate that the probability of a property which has been flooded during every flood event in the last 20 years is one of the most likely to be flooded again next time. And we can assure you that information has been provided to the council on all of these flood events. So without a resolution, homeowners become trapped in a blighted property. In all the cases that we have looked at, it's simply not possible to flood-proof a property on your own without engagement from the council to facilitate negotiations with the Highways Department or other surrounding landowners. We're aware that the emphasis for the flood officers has been on the statutory duty of reviewing planning applications, and would like to submit evidence for you to consider of the case of Sonser Grange. I believe you've all had these papers over the weekend, so perhaps you've spotted the difference in these two plans. The one on the left is from 2014 from the Floodland Consultants and includes 5 attenuation ponds, while the second, more recent plan includes just 1 pond and a swale channel which leads downhill. What you cannot see on these two plans is the gradient of the land. It has a bit of a delay, this, doesn't it? The Stafford Road into Eckershaw is some 29 metres higher in elevation than the Stone Road. So it's a pretty steep slope, about the equivalent of 5 or 6 houses. And the development completed by Bovis has a great deal of hard landscaping. There's not much sustainable drainage there. So the swale simply accelerates the flow of water downhill instead of collecting in a series of balancing ponds as was originally planned, then flooding properties onto the Stone Road. Sufficient land is still available to retrofit the missing attenuation ponds, but since Bovis have now left the site, and without wanting to get into a blame game, the Eckershaw Flood Action Group seems unable to get anybody to help us to get a project off the ground to look at remediation or reinstating the balancing ponds. In 2019, when Bovis sought to add more houses to the original permission, Eckershaw residents and councillors raised concerns about flood risk, which was ignored. In permitting the changes to the plans, the planning officer reported that no objection had been raised to the application by any statutory consultees with responsibility for flood risk. So, was someone asleep at the wheel? As a consequence, the County Council had to spend an unbudgeted £250,000 to help address this problem in Eckershaw on the Stone Road. But unfortunately, we still cannot say that this money has solved the problem in the long term because the uphill source of the water has still not been addressed. In the Eckershaw Neighbourhood Plan, adopted in 2016, the River Sow is mentioned just 4 times, and flooding is not mentioned at all. So we can only hope that flooding will be considered more seriously in the next round of neighbourhood plans. I'm nearly at the end, sorry for going over time. Looking forward, we do also know that our ageing sewage works are already beyond the initial capacity. And sewage is being discharged in Eckershaw for the equivalent of 52 days. That's 52 days at 24 hours. While not the responsibility of the County Council, perhaps this committee could at least consider publishing and reviewing these statistics and putting public pressure on the sewage companies to do something about this. These are shocking levels of sewage discharge. Land issues have been mentioned by several of you this afternoon, and Staffordshire Wildlife have been immensely helpful to us. Oh, sorry. Sorry, it's your wife. Here we go. Oh dear, sorry. That's a bit of a delay. I'm just trying to get the field picture. This is your, here we go. Just to give you a small example, Staffordshire Wildlife identified 3 nature-based activities which could alleviate this source of surface water, possibly like the situation that you mentioned in the woods. But here you have ploughing on the top field, which is vertical, so acting like a channel, which could easily be ploughed right to left. If a cover crop had been planted, the rain would not carry the soil and silt into the highway and the public drains, and a balancing pond would keep the water from pooling around the properties. Staffordshire Wildlife point out that while the drainage has now been improved on the A519, without a pond to retain water up here on the A519, it simply enters the Sow more quickly, pushing the problem downstream and into Stafford. So without more balancing ponds upstream, there is nothing to slow the flow into the town. So a high-level view needs to be taken on these issues. Eckershaw is not on a main river, and all these events could have been avoided in the past and can be prevented in the future. There's no shortage of community willpower or enthusiasm or energy in Eckershaw, I can assure you. Flood victims have been met with cries of no money before officers have even looked at the problems in detail, never mind seeking to identify solutions. Meanwhile, the council is having to waste resources on official complaints and freedom of information requests because information is not put into the public domain. We also think of Staffordshire, you know, it's a county with great engineering credentials, JCB, there's a hydrogeology section at Keele University, and as I say, plenty of enthusiasm certainly in Eckershaw. And we'd all rather work towards the long-term solution so that we can put on our pyjamas at night and not worry about having to get up, find the pump and block the traffic on a busy A road. I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I groaned when I read this report that came out last Thursday to see that the focus was on spending time on a new website and social media. Neither of these are going to stop water entering a home. You need engineers and engineering. And talk of providing information about resilience is, I can't think of a polite word. The definition of resilience is being able to recover from an event. These households in Staffordshire that have been flooded and recovered 2, 3 and 4 times are already resilient. They've had to recover and they have done. And these taxpayers don't need a patronising social media campaign. They need resources to be directed towards ensuring that they don't have to recover for a 5th time. And there's a simple measure of what success looks like. Of those homes that have been flooded, that have written to their councillors and their MPs because they can't get support from their local officers, of those that have been flooded, how many are confident their homes will not be flooded again? This report, I mean, I'm just commenting as an outsider, I'm sorry, not a politician, but this report lacks details, deadlines, maps, clear objectives, funding information and budgets. I run a business and that wouldn't be acceptable for me for that level of expenditure. Why are the minutes of the flood group meetings not in the public domain? Why is all that information secret? If you neglect to address persistent and repetitive flood risks, homes and businesses will be flooded again and again. And we just hope that you will use your powers to ensure this does not happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Mrs Bramwell. It's been most informative. I don't even know where Eckershaw is, so I've had to look it up before I came to today's meeting. I noticed that Jamie, our officer at the back, has taken some extensive notes, as have I. So after today's meeting, before we go on to see if there's any questions for you, we'll take up the issue of the report it, because I think sometimes it can be a little bit long-winded, especially when you're trying to find specifics. But that's something that goes back to IT, and our cabinet members can take that back and we can check on that. Has anybody got any questions for Mrs Bramwell on her presentation? No. Councillor Hutton.
Can I just make one comment? There's 1 million people in Staffordshire, and when we give out information, we have to give out information to 1 million people, and that's why we have to have effective communication, and that's why the website needs to be much, much better, because it's not effective at the moment, and that's why we're putting the money in for 1 million people. So I'd just like to make that point. Thank you. Thank you.
Nobody got any questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for today, Sue, if that's okay to call you Sue. Thank you for your presentation. You are free to leave if you so wish, and we'll move on to the recommendations that we've got today on the flooding strategy, which you've all got in your bundles. The Council's flood risk management team's proposed work plan priorities for 2021 and 22. We've all seen those, we've been able to comment on those, and we've been able to ask questions. So are we all happy for that recommendation? Yes? Put your hands up. Yes, thank you. B, the proposed process and timescales for the flood risk management strategy refresh. All happy with what you've seen with those and ask questions? Okay, I don't have anything to the contrary. I'd like to add a C, if I may. And that is to have the implementation plan brought back to us, maybe in 6 months, maybe a year, Jamie, Simon, just so we can assess it and see what it looks like and see about any progress that we've made. Is that okay with
I think
both of you?
6 months is a really good idea. And just to say, I will ensure we get a full response out to Sue as well on the back of that informative presentation that she gave us as well.
Brilliant. And also we need to make sure Councillor Pert is doing what he needs to be doing with these.
He's the local member, isn't he?
Yes,
so,
he's the local member.
We'll copy him into that.
Okay, so if everybody's happy with that, we'll move on to the next item. Once I find my agenda. Item 5 is the infrastructure and lighting for Staffordshire performance review. Yes, Simon and Jamie, you can now leave. Over to you, Councillor David Williams.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to do a very quick introduction to this, and then we're open to questions from the report. Obviously, highways are important, and since the last year's committee update, we've now opened the Stafford Western Access Road and the Lichfield Southern Bypass to the tune of £80 million investment into Staffordshire. Despite the challenges of the pandemic, the supply chain challenges and getting hold of manpower and work power out there, both of those projects have been delivered on time and within budget. However, we've got a greater challenge at the moment, which is government funding levels for local road maintenance. Just for your information, in Staffordshire, street lighting is protected by a private financing initiative or PFI contract, but across the rest of our highway asset, the scale of the challenge is enormous. doesn't only affect the amount of work that we can deliver, but also the way that that work is delivered to comply with statutory duties. The consequences are quite evident, and in the continued decline of our road conditions, so are the customer satisfaction levels. Cabinet are not sitting back and accepting this, and as well as ramping up the lobbying of our local MPs, highlight the impact of these funding challenges we're having on local communities, and it's not just here in Staffordshire, this is a national issue. We're also developing an exciting, hopefully, new highways transformation programme, which will be brought to the committee early in the new year. In the meantime, the service has got to live within its financial means, and we do have contract governance and performance management arrangements that help to support this. So we've sent a report to the committee to provide an overview of the current arrangements for consideration and discussion. Open to questions, Chair.
Thank you. Jamie, are you sitting there rather quietly today? Nothing to add? James, sorry. Jamie.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to run through the report if that's required, but Councillor Williams and I spoke beforehand and we were conscious of time, so Councillor Williams suggested we just do the quick introduction and go straight open.
Any questions? Councillor Hutton.
The only question I have is, I recently had a query about lighting and got some very helpful advice back to pass on to a constituent. But the one thing that really impressed me that I learnt was that the changeover to LED lighting will save 2,500 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year and save the council £1 million in charges. I think that's brilliant. But only one constituent knows that, and me, because I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it on the council website, because we should be shouting this from the rooftops. It's really good news. For highways to come up with a good news story is brilliant, and I think we should push it. Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, we have done a fair bit of press when we first released it, and I think on a regular basis that will happen, especially with what we've done now with highways and having a dedicated comms officer for highways who will be showing the good things that we do and doing a lot more interaction. But I take your point.
Councillor Flunder.
Hi there, and someone that used to work with the institution lighting engineers, I can understand where some of this comes from, because the contracts seem to be quite specific in relation to street lighting, as others do not. I'm interested to see that it's going to be carrying on till 2028 in terms of replacement bit by bit, as it were. The vast majority have already been done, of course, and it's only a few thousand left to do now. Obviously, I assume that you're going to continue this until the bitter end, and that all the replacements will be in place by that date, as specified on the renewal programme. I just wondered, now we're some 20, well, not 20 quite years in, but 15 years down the line, are they standing up to their hype in terms of not being needed to be repaired and maintained, and still being able to keep within their capacity of use, as it were, in terms of saving electricity and all the rest of it, and maintaining the light levels that were originally achieved? Just interesting as a lighting person myself, in terms of what they say on the box isn't necessarily exactly what you get out in the real world. So I just wondered if you've got any comments in relation to, is it as good as it would appear from the start, and is it likely to continue?
Yes.
That's it.
That would be the actual answer.
Thank you.
Just for your information, yes, and you're quite right. The project is bang on target. It is doing exactly what it says on the tin. James and I were discussing the lighting not long ago about the fact that a lot of the old actual columns really needed replacement anyway. And by the end of this, we will already then started on to the rotational part of making sure that what's now been replaced is still fit for purpose. So that's part of this. But yeah, absolutely, we are going forward. It's on schedule, and we are seeing the differences. We are also reducing light pollution around the area with being as their LEDs are more directional. And personally, in certain areas, I think it's made a massive difference to the way that the road looks. and not being yellow also means that people can actually see what things are these days. So very much so, I do think it's working, and it is bang on time.
Yeah, interesting to know that the street lighting columns are not going to last as long as necessarily the lighting units you're attaching to them. Generally, I don't know whether that's going to make any difference in the future. But certainly in terms of the lighting columns and everything else, is that something that you are going to be planning as the next phase in all this, in terms of trying to make lighting even simpler and brighter and more directional? I assume that there's going to be upgrades from Philips and other manufacturers around the world as time goes on. So I assume that you are going to, during the next round of replacements and everything else, going to continue this improved technology and improved efficiency and everything else, so that not only are we gaining advantage now, but we're going to be gaining advantage for the foreseeable future. Yes. Are you going to say yes again?
Well, of course, yes, I'm going to say yes. I think the report does explain that one of the massive benefits of this PFI contract, which I can't claim any benefit or credit for, or take any credit for, it was developed back in 2003. But that asset renewal program does mean that latest technology can constantly, as technology emerges, obviously it can be taken on board. But the retrofit program also recognises that, so it's got a standalone business case to say, well, actually we can go back now at a point in time and replace units that are still work, but they're just not, there's a strong business case to invest in retrofitting with better technology, and that will always be the case. So we'll hope that this technology will continue in the future, and yes, it may be robust and still working, hopefully. And I think that's played out well in the performance information that you can see in the report around lighting, the reliability of the units, and also the customer satisfaction for a street lighting service. But regardless of that, if there's a business case to invest in more technology, which further saves on energy costs, then of course that's what would happen.
James, can I just ask, when we have new developments, we're not going to allow them to put the old style back in. We are going to stipulate that they need to be LED lighting from the outset, aren't we? He's going to answer yes to that.
Yes as well.
Yeah, the answer is yes. It's part of a residential design guide, yeah, for street lighting requirements to do that. And it has to be compliant with the contract for the maintenance arrangements so that it can be adopted. Otherwise, obviously they've got discretion, but it wouldn't be adopted, and then they would remain with the developer.
Sorry, very quickly, Chair. I've had a few issues with parish councils, not massive amounts of lights, but they normally have anything between 3 and 10 lights that they have to look after down mostly roads that aren't part of our network, etc. I'm just wondering whether or not you could allow them to have some information in relation to what units they could be fitting themselves to be able to produce better effects and things. I assume that information is available already, but I've had at least 2 or 3 questions recently where they didn't know where to turn to try and find what they should now be trying to adhere to, if you see what I mean. Thank you.
Dare I say it? I'm going to say yes, of course. Absolutely. I think we'd be delighted to be able to give any advice and support to parish councils about what sort of technology is available and what might suit them best.
And just quickly,
Yes.
when we report lighting, sometimes it belongs to borough councils or district councils, and then sometimes the columns belong to us as a county asset. Do we have, I'm just looking at additional performance information as one of the recommendations, do we have any form of mapping system that could be, like we do for highways, that could be sent out so that in each division we know roughly who owns the lamppost? Because it becomes a real pain when you report it, and then we do it on the report it system, and then it goes to somebody else because it could be on housing, for example, land. Do you know where I'm coming from?
I think that's a really good point. I can't honestly, hand on heart, say whether or not we've got the functionality to do that right now. Steve Bradbury is the street lighting manager. I know Steve would know the answer to that if he was here. Unfortunately, he was taken seriously ill last week, so he's not been able to make it today. But yeah, in terms of the ability to be able to go onto a GIS page and click onto an actual asset to tell you who the owner is, and therefore when you were trying to report a defect to it, then absolutely it sounds completely logical. I'm sure we've got the capability, and we've certainly got the accurate inventory information to be able to do that. But I'll have to come back to you with the precise answer about whether we can do it right now.
That's brilliant, because that will fit into the one of the recommendations of additional performance. We'll know who to report it to then, because it does become a bit of a bind when you're trying to get it to one person and it's actually somebody else's. Are there any further questions for the officers or David Williams? No? Okay, then, that was quick. So we've got two recommendations. Consider and scrutinise the update of the contract performance for the Infrastructure Plus Partnership and Lighting for Staffordshire Private Finance Initiative, PFI, and consider what additional performance information would be beneficial in ensuring both contracts are achieving the required aims. So if we can get the answer to that mapping system, I think that covers that recommendation. And if that can just come out via email or via Jonathan, and he'll send it out to us all. So are we happy with both of those recommendations? Yes. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the next item, which is Bus Transport Inquiry Day. Now, are one of you going to do that in Darrell Ayre's absence, or are we skipping that one for today? Oh, sorry, Dominic.
No, we have. I've got probably the best person in the county
Dominic,
for it.
I spotted you.
I'm just going to do a very, very quick introduction, Chair. The Bus Inquiry Day was first discussed 2 years ago, but due to COVID, it had to be postponed. So, following discussions with yourself, the purpose of the day has been redefined, and the presentation today sets out the scene in preparation for the Inquiry Day, which is due to take place in January 22. I'll hand over to Dominic, who is absolutely brilliant at this, and will be able to take you through whatever you want. If you want him to go through the presentation, or if you just want to ask questions, please feel free.
Dominic, if you can just quickly go through what the bullet points that we had from Darrell, Clive Thompson, sorry. Have you got those?
Yes, I've actually...
You've got them on there.
I think Jonathan might be just about to put it on the screen.
Yeah. Oh, that's gone straight away.
Right, thank you. So this is just a presentation to give members some background in advance of the bus Transport Inquiry Day that's planned for January. So what I just wanted to run through was really some basics that underpin the way that bus services are provided and the environment that they operate in. So I'll cover off very briefly the regulatory framework, sources of finance for the bus network, a little bit about the bus market in Staffordshire, the national bus strategy that we've just submitted our bus service improvement plan for, and some of the current challenges that the bus industry are facing, and then if there's anything I haven't covered at the end, I'm happy to take those in questions. So for the past 35 years, since 1986, bus services have operated in a deregulated environment, and I think it's fair to say, despite that amount of time, a lot of people still perceive that local authorities such as the County Council actually control the bus services, which isn't the case. So basically anybody can set up as a bus operator. They can apply for an operator licence, and subject to meeting the basic legal criteria, including financial standing, having a competent transport manager, somewhere to run your vehicles from, and a maintenance contract, that entity can have an operator licence, and then essentially go forward and register to operate a local bus service if they wish. Now, the majority of the bus network is made up of commercial for-profit services where essentially an operator makes an assessment of the market of where they'll determine their route, fares and timetables and operate a service in accordance with that and return a profit. Now, that won't cover necessarily all of the transport needs that are out there. And so the Transport Act 1985 gave local authorities the right to add services to that commercial network by going out to tender for those. And they term those socially necessary services. So those are essentially services where the local authority recognises there is a value to having those services, but they won't return a profit in the economic sense. In Staffordshire, we currently have a supported local service budget of £1.2 million. 0.7 million pounds of that is a grant that we receive from the Department for Transport each year. The Traffic Commissioner is the independent regulator, and their role is to grant operator licences to hold the ring on registering bus services and to hold both operators, transport managers and PSV and HGV drivers to account for matters of conduct. And they have a quasi-judicial role. They can take action against operators, they can remove licences entirely, they can restrict them, curtail them and take a range of regulatory action. The day-to-day roadside enforcement is carried out by the Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency, the DVSA. So they are the officers who will be at the side of the road and they will do physical inspections of vehicles, for example, for safety. They will go into operators' premises and they will audit the systems in place and inspect vehicles at those premises. And the final one is just to say on customer complaints, and that we at the council receive a lot of complaints about bus services, but we're not able to deal with them because the buses operate in a commercial environment. So the operator has to deal with customer complaints in the first instance, but the Bus Users UK does provide an independent dispute resolution service. So if a customer's not satisfied with the response they get from an operator, they can refer it to Bus Users UK for them to look at independently. So just to cover off the four key sources of income that fund the bus network, I think the first one is fairly obvious, which is the fares that passengers pay when they buy a ticket. We've also got concessionary bus pass holders, for which the bus operators have a legal duty to accept those passes and provide free travel. And we as the local transport authority have a legal duty to reimburse the bus operator for those journeys, those passenger journeys that they've carried. Now, that is a reimbursement for fares that the bus operator would otherwise have had. If there was no concession, then those passengers boarding the bus would have paid a fare. And so our role is to essentially make that loss to the operator good, so that they're no better and no worse off. So there is a perception sometimes that that's a subsidy, but it isn't, because it's just reimbursing into the fare box what that operator would have received if there was no concession. Then we have Bus Service Operators Grant, which used to be known as fuel duty rebate, because it is a grant that is paid based on the consumption of diesel and other fuel used for operating commercial bus services. So that's currently paid directly by the Department for Transport at a rate of 34.5p a litre of diesel used on commercial bus services. The Department for Transport sometime in the next year is intending to consult on reforming BSOG, because at the moment, it's based on use of fuel, and obviously, decarbonisation and climate change are very high up the agenda. So we would expect to see some changes to reflect that. And then the final source is the payments made for the operation of contracted bus services. So that's the £1.2 million a year of contracted services that we have that supplement the commercial network. Just going on to bus journeys in Staffordshire. So the graph that's on the screen, which probably isn't terribly clear, unfortunately, is essentially on the left-hand side, we've got the number of bus passenger journeys each quarter. So towards the top is 4.5 million, and the bottom of the graph is 0. And then we are at the very left-hand side. It's 2013, working across to the far right of the graph, which is the last quarter before the pandemic in March 2020. So what you can see there is the top line is the total number of is total journeys by bus in Staffordshire. So that's every time somebody sets foot on a bus at a bus stop in Staffordshire, that counts as a bus passenger journey. And in a period of approximately 8 years, that's gone down from about 4.5 million passenger journeys per quarter down to about 2.5 million. So as you can see, that's quite a substantial decline that's occurred. Now the bottom line is the journeys made using concessionary passes only. Now, although those journeys are free of charge to the user, you can still see that there has been a decline, albeit less marked, from about 2 million passenger journeys a quarter down to about 1.5. And broadly speaking, concessions make up 50 to 60% of bus passenger journeys, so it is quite a substantial proportion. Now, the decline that you can see there on that graph isn't unusual when you look around the country. So across the country, when you look at the statistics nationally, we're kind of mirroring what's happening in other shire counties. Notwithstanding that, though, the bus does still remain the most important public transport mode. So just to give you an idea, even now, buses in Staffordshire carry about twice as many passenger journeys as the rail network within Staffordshire, just to give you an idea of scale. Now, there's many reasons we could go into as to what's caused some of the decline in that graph on the previous slide. But a key one is that bus fares and the affordability of using the bus has been impacted over time. So the bottom line on that graph is consumer price index. The middle line, the green one, is inflation of bus fares in English non-metropolitan areas, so outside the big conurbations. And then the blue line at the top is England outside of London in total. But what you can see is that the red line at the bottom, which is inflation, has gone up quite gently. But then you can see bus fares have climbed above that. So in real terms, bus fares have got more expensive. And we know that every time bus fares go up, whilst and that's a reasonable response from bus operators who've got rising operating costs that they need to cover, but nevertheless, whilst they achieve a greater revenue yield, it means people are using buses less because they become less affordable. And that is a concern as time goes on. And if we were to plot on that graph the cost of using the private car in real terms, then although fuel prices have gone up a lot recently, you would see that line a lot lower because motoring costs in real terms have been a lot more static. And so you can see that bus passengers are perhaps at a disadvantage there. So the National Bus Strategy, which was titled Bus Back Better, was published back in March of this year. And that had a stated aim of transforming bus networks around the country, and there was a desire by the government to recognise the vital role that bus services play for both society and the economy. So the basis of delivering the National Bus Strategy that was put forward was essentially as a partnership approach between local authorities and their bus operators to work together to submit what was called a bus service improvement plan. Now, although this was published back in March, we were tasked with producing a bus service improvement plan by the end of October, which was a very challenging timescale, but we met that. And our BSIP has gone into the Department for Transport with a bid for £113 million over 4 years to invest in the bus network in totality in Staffordshire. Now, what I would say is that our approach with that has been to focus that on schemes where there's a substantial amount in there put forward for investment in infrastructure, so that's everything from bus stations, bus stops, shelters, improved information, real-time information displays that passengers told us were important, and also for pump priming improvements to bus services, so investing money up front to improve services and then to reverse that decline that you saw on that previous graph and turn that into growth. That's the aim of what we want to do with the bus service improvement plan. That will be put into action through what's called an enhanced partnership, which is a legal mechanism under the Bus Services Act 2017, and that's a legally binding agreement between the County Council and its bus operators. And the bottom line on that slide, if there's an electronic version that's distributed, will take you directly to our bus service improvement plan. Just wanted to touch on some of the challenges that the bus industry currently faces. So at the moment, as you can imagine, bus passenger numbers are still below pre-pandemic levels, particularly amongst concessionary pass holders. So when I wrote this slide, the latest available figure was that the bus network was at about 80% of pre-pandemic patronage, and feedback that we get from operators is that concessionary passengers typically lag by about 10 percentage points. So concessionary pass holders have been slower to return to the bus. I think in light of announcements over the weekend about new COVID variants, there's a possibility that 80% figure will, might temporarily flatline, or there might be a dip. So we need to see how that pans out. The bus industry is facing a shortage of drivers. Now, there's been a lot in the news about a shortage of HGV drivers, and not very much is said about bus and coach drivers. Now, unfortunately, what's happened is a lot of bus and coach drivers are dual qualified, and we've seen a lot leaving the industry to go and drive HGVs, and that's left a very challenging position for bus operators to be able to maintain their driver numbers to maintain service. And whereas the HGV industry has got the ability to increase wages, the bus industry is currently constrained because it's carrying fewer passengers than pre-pandemic and is under condition of grant from the Department for Transport that caps what fare rises can be put in place at the moment. Department for Transport recovery funding is in place, but it is on a reducing basis, and our belief is that that is putting some services at risk at the moment, and that's not where we want to be with that. Town centre economies are changing along with travel patterns, so bus users shop a lot more in town centres than do car users, and so people's changing travel habits, with perhaps shopping online more, working at home more. That has a direct impact on how people travel. and so there's a challenge for the bus network to respond to that. Traffic congestion, that contributes to the challenges of running a reliable bus network, and as congestion increases, you need to put more resource in to get the same level of service out, particularly for it to run reliably. And then the last one on there is about car parking policy, which can create an uneven playing field, because that has the availability of free parking, particularly out of town sites and supermarkets, provides more of an incentive for people to use the car and makes it more challenging to attract people out of the car and onto the bus. I think it's fair to say there are some opportunities after going through all of that. Buses have a valuable role to play in transport decarbonisation and reducing overall emissions. I'm sure you've probably all seen slides of, you can get 70 people on one double-decker bus, and that could take 70 cars off the road with obvious environmental benefits. Buses contribute significantly to our town centre economies and provide access to employment, education and healthcare, all of which has a value. The bus network keeps people active and independent for longer, which is one of the County Council's objectives in its strategic plan. People can reach a point where some people don't have access to a car, some people reach a point where they can no longer drive, and so the bus network becomes a lifeline for them. Even a small shift, modest shift away from the car to the bus, we're talking about maybe 1 or 2 journeys a week, that can play a valuable role in reducing congestion and releasing road network capacity, which of course then helps all road users. And as we've mentioned, the National Bus Strategy could bring about significant investment to Staffordshire's bus network and reverse that decline that we've seen in that earlier graph. I think the date on that's unfortunately wrong, and it should be the 21st of January, but I was just asked just to drop in some details there for members of what the agenda that was planned for the inquiry day in January. So that's just to restate the aim, to understand how the public transport network, including community transport in Staffordshire, operates, to understand more about our bus service improvement plan, and to make recommendations about how those funds should be spent in line with the BSIP, and to investigate options for the enhanced partnership, which is the delivery mechanism for the BSIP. And then on the next one, I think that just breaks it down into how that day is planned. And I think that covers it.
Can you just go back to that slide, Dominic, please? Because the start time should read 10 o'clock. I know it's not you that's put it together. And lunch break will be half an hour, not an hour. And Jonathan's hoping to get some lunch for us, so we won't need to leave the building or do whatever. Just so that everybody, just so the members know that it's a 10 o'clock start, and there'll be a 15-minute break, and lunch will only be half an hour, so that we should be finished way before our scheduled time. We don't know what that's going to be yet, so hopefully before 3 o'clock, but I'm hoping it's earlier than that. But just so members are aware that it is a 10 o'clock start, not 10:30 or any later. Any questions for Dominic on what he's given you today? Are we all clear on what we want to achieve, where we want to go with it? It gives me great pleasure to say that Councillor Flunder will be leading on it, so you won't have to listen to my dulcet tone. What are you clapping for? You won't have to listen to my dulcet tones on that day. Sorry? I will be here, yes, but as it's overview and scrutiny, the vice chairs have to play a role too. So I'm delegating, is what I'm saying. So nobody's got any questions then?
No.
Brilliant.
Can I just have a few comments? This is not a question.
Can you do them after the meeting?
No, it's for this.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to one thing that Tina, and that is, if members want to invite someone along to the inquiry day, relevant to the bus company
granny or
industry.
your
Yeah,
mum.
we don't want any relatives. But anyone that's running small bus services or community bus services, that type of thing, anything that has relevance to this, can you let Jonathan know those people? There's limited numbers. We're not going to have a massive number of this, so maybe 1.5 each. If you can cut someone in half, that would be good, in terms of all the members, roughly. There are some other members that are going to be attending anyway, from Clive Thompson's team and also the bus operators, so they'll be there as well. And I do urge you to try and read up on everything before the inquiry day, so you've got plenty of time, lots of Christmas reading. You see, you can
said the C word.
yeah, I know, you can just over Christmas Day itself, when you got, you know, the dinner's over and everything else, sit there and read up about the fantastic bus services in Staffordshire. I hope you understand my sarcasm in this, but anyway, so just prepare for the day. If there's any questions you want answering before then that's the time to get back to me, Ross or Tina, if there's any questions that you might want to be asked. Well, okay, give it to me. Give the questions to me, Tina says. Right, okay. So if there's any questions you want, or if there's any doubt about who you can ask, just have a quick chat with myself. And myself and Jonathan are going to be dealing with this and trying to put groups together and we're also going to try and come up with some questions for the 2 work sessions. So if any of you have got any ideas that you would like to try and that covered, including Clive's team and everyone else, the questions they would like to be asked during those work scheduled 1-hour periods, then again, questions to me, and we'll try and broker some sort of project, so we're not just sitting there going, what's all this about then on the day? We would like to have some idea about what we're trying to achieve. Okay? Does that make sense? Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to the last item, which is I believe it's the last item. Yeah. Work programme, Jonathan?
Thank you, Chairman. It's just set out in the report. I've highlighted the new bits that I've added since the last meeting, so it's just to approve those, if you're happy with them.
Phone's always good. Is the next normal meeting Friday the 21st of January. So we've got the Community Transport and Supported Bus Network Inquiry Day. So we'll have done that, which is that is that day.
Yeah, we've got the meeting on the 13th,
13th is
Chairman.
Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry.
Which has been moved from the 14th.
Yes, I'm on the wrong page.
Yeah, me going then.
Sorry, Thursday the 13th of January, so that Philip White can attend. All party member working group report, future economy and enterprise update. So that's going to be Alan White, Simon Tagg, although he's not doing it anymore, so I might need to talk to him about that. Economic recovery, renewal and transformation 6-month update. Again, that's Philip White. And HS2 6-month update as well. Everyone happy with that? Councillor Smith?
Chairman, we talked at a previous meeting when we were going to be the scrutiny panel that would look at climate change. Then it went to the corporate scrutiny, that we were going to look at the possibility of having that as a joint scrutiny panel. That doesn't seem to have happened. My request to join that meeting, which the chairman said he was happy that I should do that, it's now going to be, will the scrutiny panel decide whether they want me on that or not, which I don't think was the spirit in which we intended to go forward.
I thought you were doing a joint meeting.
We had the climate change meeting 2 Fridays ago, and you weren't on that, were you? But it was agreed that you would be a member on that meeting. I was in attendance.
Chairman, you'll record that we were both together when we asked to attend that. I was not invited.
Right, okay.
And
we'll rectify that for the next meeting.
I followed that up, and it would now appear that the chairman of that committee is saying that he will ask the committee whether they want to add any extra people to it, yes or no.
Right, we'll
That's
sort
not
that.
the spirit that I
No,
understood we were following.
We'll sort that. We've also just had an email from said Conor Warman reference Highways Transformation Plan. That's not on today's agenda.
No, Chairman, that's actually programmed, I think, for a later meeting. Is it around about March time? Yeah, 18th of March, Chairman. Highways
Okay.
Infrastructure Transformation.
That's brilliant. I'll answer Councillor Warman on that one then. Okay, if there's nothing further to add, then I'll close the meeting at exactly 4 o'clock. And those of you that are attending the triangulation meeting, which I believe is just us three, and the officers at the back of the room, thank you very much. Safe journey home. Drive carefully, walk carefully. And I'm not going to say Merry Christmas, but it's only November. Thank you, everyone.
Meeting.